So we're going to look at the cognitive approach to psychology. Now, if you remember, the cognitive approach came about in the 1960s, I suppose, and it took on the baton really from the behaviourist approach. The behaviourist approach had been involved with readily observable behaviours and was really looking at learning, but the cognitive approach decided that it wanted to look a little bit more deep into what was happening inside people's brains, really, I suppose, their mental processes, and looking back at that idea of consciousness that had been picked up by Wilhelm Wundt back in the beginning of psychology. So let's cut to the chase and show you the approach is interested in the study of mental processes. So that could be memory, it could be learning, it could be consciousness, it could be anything to do with mental processes. Now, this is the really important part that we need to get right, because very often AQA are likely to ask strange questions about particular key terms, and the key term here is inferred. Okay, so in the cognitive approach, what happens is that mental processes are inferred indirectly. So depending on what is happening, so it'll be a lab study of some sort, most likely, and it could be more than that, but lab study in the main, then the mental processes can't be directly measured, can they? So just like Wilhelm Wundt found, you can't just go inside someone's head and start measuring the mental processes. So what you're looking at is particular behaviors, particular things that people do or say, perhaps in some cases, but mainly do, which give an indirect measurement of their mental process, and therefore the mental process can be inferred from that. I hope that makes a bit of sense. Okay, so participant behavior in certain test conditions, etc. Okay, so the cognitive approach is very often referred to as being a little bit like a computerized type of approach. What it's looking at is it's thinking of the human mind, the human brain, as being a bit like an information processing unit, a bit like a computer. Now, we've come across theories that are associated with this area on numerous occasions. If you go back to your work on memory, you'll see the multi-store model, the working memory model, etc. There are very much information processing type of models. The reason being is that they're based very easily and comfortably sit within the cognitive approach. So, like I say, the approach utilizes an information processing analogy. Essentially, the brain has different cognitive stores, and information passes through these stores just like it would in a computer. Okay, so that's how cognitive psychologists see humans and see their psychology. One of the important key terms in the cognitive approach and the key concepts is the concept of schemas. So if you think about schemas as being a little bit like a shortcut on a keyboard, so bringing in that whole sort of information processing analogy again. So what does a shortcut on actually even better than that, what about like an app on a mobile phone? What the app does, or what the keyboard shortcut does, is it allows you to get to a particular program or a particular website really quickly, all right? And that's exactly what a schema does. A schema is a little package, a little shortcut, a little package of information and ideas, okay? And these packages are put together through experience, so I think I remember at the time talking to you about going through a door. How do we know how to use a door? Well, not all doors are exactly the same, but most of them are. So we know the basic process, don't we? And the reason we know the basic process is because we have these schemas for opening doors. If we had to go to a door every time without this schema and completely relearn how to open a door, well, life would be a bore and a chore, wouldn't it? So these packages of information are really important, these schemas. Okay. So it acts as a mental framework to help us deal with new pieces of information. We can generalize out, can't we? If that door is similar to other doors, then it's going to open in the same way. Okay. Babies, according to this particular approach, have very basic, simple motor schemas, and over time they become more complex, more sophisticated as we accumulate new information. Okay, that process is called accommodation. We don't need to know that, but that's part of the of cognitive psychology. So, basic point there is that the concept of schema is really important. If you have a question which asks you about cognitive psychology and you don't mention schemas, then you will have done yourself out of quite a few marks. Okay, so bear that in mind. Another part to recognise in here is we've got to think about the cognitive approach in its historical context, I suppose. And that cognitive psychology hasn't just stood still. It's emerged, it's changed, and you have a whole branch of cognitive psychology which is called cognitive neuroscience. Cognitive neuroscience is that kind of link, if you will, is sort of the bit that moves on to the biological approach. Remember, the biological approach comes after the cognitive approach, so it's the bridge between those two, really. So it uses brain scanning techniques. Okay, it allows us to look at brain structures and how they influence our mental processes. So we're still interested in mental processes. Maybe not quite as inferring as much as we were, although there is still inference goes on. Cognitive neuroscience helped us to show us that semantic and episodic parts of the long-term memory are found on opposite sides of the prefrontal cortex. So before brain scanning techniques, well, okay, we could have a theory that they must be in different parts of the brain. Okay, that's what we've thought for a long time, isn't it? But now we're actually able to demonstrate that because cognitive neuroscience using brain scanning techniques has allowed us to find those different parts and to infer their particular roles. It's also allowed us to show the link between OCD and the parahippocampal gyrus, so that particular part of the brain that seems to be associated with the onset and the maintenance of OCD. Well, cognitive neuroscience has allowed us to make that link empirically because of scanning techniques. So in terms of evaluation, the cognitive approach has got obviously a lot of good things going for it, but it's got some issues as well. Let's have a look at some of the strengths to start off with. Well, it uses scientific methods in order to produce an objective way of studying the mind. Now that's a good thing, isn't it? Because obviously they are controlled and they allow it, like I've said here, for biology and cognitive psychology to kind of work together. So the methods employed in the cognitive approach are scientific, and what that has done is led to some big real-world applications. So I've got down here artificial intelligence, for instance, but we can go further than that, can't we? We can talk about things like cognitive behavioral therapy, which has obviously been assessed using scientific methods, etc. In fact, you could use the real-world application of cognitive behavioral therapy as a separate point in its own right. In terms of some limitations, then, it suffers from machine reductionism. And machine reductionism is the idea that actually the human mind is seen as being like an information processing unit, rather than the multifaceted thing that we know it to be, which is obviously it's a massive oversimplification. But the reason it's done that way is it helps us to recognize cognitive features as almost like schematics, if you will, and that helps models to be formed. However, it is reductionist, and that is an issue with it. Artificial stimuli are used as part of the scientific method. Now, be careful when you're using this that you don't just start talking about the issues with the scientific method. You need to apply that to the cognitive psychology approach. So the fact that an awful lot of the evidence for the cognitive approach comes from lab studies which use artificial stimuli means it's very difficult to generalize those results out to the wider population, and as such they lack external validity. ecological validity being one of those measures. So that's an issue with the cognitive approach, the methodologies that are used to support it. Just going further on from that, if we think about determinism, so determinism is that concept, isn't it, that we don't have a choice over the actions that we make. Well, the cognitive approach is actually a reasonably well balanced approach in that respect, in that it allows us, I guess, to have some choice, but at the same point it does say that there are underlying mechanisms that take choice away. We call that soft determinism, so it's not the hard determinism of behaviourism, for instance, and that is the strength of this, because that has a degree of face validity. We believe, don't we, that we have some degree of free will, and the cognitive approach allows for that, so that's a good thing. And the last thing then, just to mention in terms of evaluation, the cognitive approach can seem, and I think most of you did find this at the time, can seem to be quite an abstract and theoretical approach. As such, it kind of fails to recognise a lot of the other factors which affect people in terms of their memory and their life, etc. As such, it produces theories that sometimes struggle to make sense of what it is to be a human. Therefore, they lack external validity. We already mentioned the external validity issues before, but you can certainly add to that now by just thinking about the theories that are produced. So hopefully you've got a good sort of idea there about the AO1, which is involved in the cognitive approach, and you should be able to evaluate it with some confidence now. Who knows what comes up in exams, but it would not surprise me to see the cognitive approach come up this year. Any problems at all, do let me know. Thank you.